A family business. Eduardo wasn't really listening. The man with the withered hand was a good teacher, and the boys all admired him for the bravery that had lost him the use of his arm. It wasn't his fault. Eduardo could see the sea through the window, but for once it wasn't the blue water that was distracting him. Maria, the girl with black hair, had agreed to let him walk her home, and his teenage boy's mind was in turmoil with imaginings and expectation. Most boys are not infatuated until they're teenagers, but since the first day they started school, when he met Maria in the playground, Eduardo had danced, bobbed, run and weaved around her. He'd invented stories and told jokes for her at village gatherings, learned tricks to show her, sat next to her at parties, and sat as close as he could in a class where the boys sat one side and the girls the other. Now she was going to let him walk her home, and they'd be alone together for the first time. He couldn't imagine exactly how it would be, but trying left no room in his head for listening to lessons. They walked around the last corner, at least an hour later than she usually did, sauntering, holding hands. Her free hand held the flower he'd found, and in front of them stood her father, a short, brown man, as hard and dry as the piece of earth he owned and worked, cradling the shotgun like a baby. His eyes pierced Eduardo's skull. He was a made man, who'd relieved the man with the withered hand the night of the disaster, finishing what had been started and carrying him away to safety. There was no doubting such a man. It was Maria who saved him, convinced her father nothing untoward had happened, that and the bearing of the boy himself. It was not in his nature to admit fear, and he had no cause to admit guilt. But Eduardo had been left in no doubt. There was no room for wasters like him in this family. 2 weeks later, school finished. They stopped being children and went home to start becoming their parents, except Eduardo, who had no farm or father to inherit from. He worked for other people when the opportunity presented. Not often. They were a self-sufficient lot round here, and between times he helped his mother and spent a lot of time idling on the beach and the sea, as Maria's father had known he would. Then the tourists started to arrive at the new hotel the boss had built. Someone was needed to push the pedalos on and off the beach, hand the fat Fräuleins in and out of them with the minimum of foot wetting, take the money from their compliant spouses, and smile at their insipid offspring. After the tourists left for dinner at the hotel, and before they arrived in the morning, it was his job to clear away the trash they littered the beach with. Between times he painted over rust stains and kept an eye on paddling infants, ignored by parents who only saw beach and shallow water and didn't raise their vision to the deep blue beyond the white sand. Other boys walked the foreign girls in the pine woods, took them to see the ruins on the hill, drank with them in bars, danced at the hotel disco, and walked with them by moonlight. Eduardo had neither passion nor desire for such things. The only foreigner he took to was Heinrich, a boy his own age. He had not come on the coach and aeroplane with the others, but turned up from the mainland bus station with a pack on his back, and stayed all summer. The two of them were like the positive and negative of a photograph. Heinrich's flat blonde hair bleached almost white by the sun next to Eduardo's tousled dark curls. It made a startling contrast, though they shared the same thoughtful, deep brown eyes. Heinrich had started off sleeping on the beach, but soon moved in with Eduardo and his mother in the tiny cottage they rented at the end of the track up the barren hillside. Feeling safe among a group of his fellows, one of the other boys had suggested their friendship was because they were gay. No one ever suggested it again. They fought back to back, without looking round or questioning the security of their rear. From the first kick that ensured that boy would not experience sex of any sort for days to come, to the straight-armed punch that split his last companion's nose, their unfaltering confidence in each other was matched only by a single-minded ferocity. It was from then the new dimension in their friendship blossomed, and Heinrich moved into the family home. Unbidden, accepted like a family member, he took on his share of chores. Until the end of summer, the two boys became inseparable. All summer, when they could get away from the beach, they'd come to sit in the cafe on the square and watch Maria, the girl with the black hair, stretching to fill the shelves in the bakery. They weren't alone in this. In a land where every woman's hair was dark, she was the girl with the black hair, and everybody knew her as that. All the men came to admire, to worship at an altar, to show perfection the deference it deserved. All except the cold, blonde one. He came on the aeroplane with the tourists and stayed at the hotel the boss had built. But he was not of the tourists. There was no family, no holiday air, no joie de vivre, no tight speedos about him. He came to see the boss, and he was all business and suit. Well, almost all. The first time he came, he had a quiet word with the boss, and a girl was brought from the town to see him. She went to the boss next day in tears, showed him the bruises, and was returned to the town well recompensed. Nobody should be treated that way, even the fallen. Now, he lived in isolation during his visits. This did not stop him coming to the cafe on the square, where his cold blue eyes tore the clothing from the girl with black hair and abused her flesh. Eduardo hated him with unquenchable passion. Such a one could not work with them in peace for long, necessary as he was to the boss. It started in an argument between him and the boss about the relative merits of their people. Times were hard, North America and Europe at peace, satellite tracking, cooperation between governments, allaying of mutual suspicions, pacts between old enemies, and none of it helped the easy flow of business for the boss. On the other hand, unrest or war from the Himalayas across the Middle East to Cyprus had disrupted production and interrupted the boss's trade routes. The whole world was changing. Transport got harder. Production areas shrank. None of it was their fault. This didn't stop the cold one sneering when he's told there'd be delays to his order. In the face of all the evidence, the boss had tremendous faith in the ability and brains of the local peasantry. Best people in the world, he would declare forcefully. The stock that gave us Leonardo and Michelangelo. Nobody had ever disagreed with him. He was the boss. It wouldn't have been healthy until that cold bastard came. He was a boss himself up in the cold north, but not like their boss, part of the community, treating it like family. Cold like the hard winter in the landlocked centre of the continent he came from. He ruled by fear instead of trust, confusing it with respect. He remained an outsider to them, someone they worked with through necessity, not choice. Then he had sneered at the boss and his people. He was the only one present who didn't realise he was lucky to leave the room alive. That he wouldn't remain so long had gone from probable to certain. Arrogant imbecile. The man with the withered hand had been keeping minutes at the meeting. The boss knew how to honour someone who brought literacy to the area. It was a shame they had to burn them at the end, but it made ceremony. The arrogant blonde pig had sneered at that as well. He had no community. Besides, he'd not bothered or understood to find out why this was done. When the man with the withered hand wrote something and burned it, he remembered it. Word for word. The boss relied on him to be able to keep his word and his honour. Here, values went beyond the expediency of the moment. The upshot was the boss had said things about his people which had been repudiated. Now they needed to be proved to maintain honour. Accordingly, the man with the withered hand had spent the school holidays sitting in the shabby green-walled office on the first floor above the square, waiting. Everyone knew the boss had set up the office and why. This was a small community where everyone knew everything and kept it close to their chest. Besides, he was the only one who set up anything unless you were big enough to pay him off. Then he would provide the building materials for your petrol station or supermarket and tell you who to employ as manager. So it came to the same thing, really. The boss had put faith in them. They desperately wanted to prove him right. Any good idea would do. The boss was no fool. He'd invest in anything. It didn't have to be illegal or show an instant profit. After all, he built the hotel and brought tourists to the small businesses that had sprung up around it. He'd paid hospital fees and sent the man with the withered hand to college after the incident, when he could have turned his back and walked away. Loyalty inspires loyalty. At first, it had been amusing to the man with the withered hand. After a while it got tedious. None of the inventions were workable outside the imagination of the perpetrators. Now, as summer was coming to an end, it was becoming desperate. All summer they'd come during lunch hour or in the early evening, unable to afford missed working time. It meant that at times he had people waiting. On the other hand, afternoons he could siesta. Mornings he'd gone downstairs, drunk coffee and watched the girl with black hair working. Watching work was a revered local occupation, but still there had been no workable ideas. Summer faded into autumn. The pedalows received a final coat of paint and were stored. The little businesses shut down to make repairs, and the hotel stopped receiving guests. It was time for Heinrich to leave, but first they killed the pig. Heinrich scratched his back with cinders and held him still, while Eduardo hit him in the forehead with the club hammer. Then they strung him up from a rafter, and Eduardo cut his throat with the old bone-handled knife he always carried, and they bled him into bowls. Heinrich had cried like a baby, then apologised profusely. "Don't be silly," Eduardo said. "He was your friend. You fed him and scratched his back. We would not be true men if we didn't feel remorse. We do what is necessary, but our feelings are our own." They prepared the carcass together, then selected the choicest joint for the final meal before Heinrich's return north to his mother for the winter. One late, slow autumn afternoon, and the man with the withered hand was asleep on the couch, preparing himself for winter, when Eduardo came into the office. The man remembered him as the brightest pupil and the worst, the most promising and the most frustrating in his class. The memories of that first class at the school the boss had built him were strong. The government said they built the school, but everyone knew nothing happened unless the boss said so. He supplemented the teaching wage as well. A man would starve on what the government paid. The man with the withered hand had not been able to mould Eduardo to his will, but he was aware of his ability, and so he listened carefully to what he said. "I've been watching the waves hit the beach all summer. They change where there is no longer still water under them. That made me think. At sea, something floated on the surface of the water will go up and down, but the water below the wave does not." He demonstrated with his hands. The man with the withered hand signalled him to continue. "If there was a float on the surface, attached to something heavy deep below the surface, the heavy thing would be lifted and dropped in still water. With the power of the lift and the drop of the weight, I thought I could change that to a forward motion. I joined 2 large plastic drink bottles with string front and back. Their torpedo shape would move through water and help keep a straight course. The top bottle had its cap screwed on for a float. I heated 3 bicycle spokes at one end and pushed them through the bottom bottle, 1 in the centre near the neck and 2 at the base, 1 each side. Then I filled the lower bottle with small stones to make it sink." He paused briefly to be sure he was understood. "I made wings from 2 pieces of zinc cut from the roof of the shed Alphonse knocked down, and wrapped them round the front spoke, the one in near the neck of the bottle. They moved up and down between the back spokes, the ones in the bottom of the bottle. As it lifted, the water forced the wings down, and as it dropped, they were pushed up. The forward spoke acted as a pivot, and the others in the base stopped the wings going too far. The water pushed against the wings, and it all moved forwards. It really worked. I put it in the sea and tried it. It headed straight out to sea, against the wind and waves, at 2 or 3 kilometres an hour. If you made the top floats hollow and joined them with flexible pipes, you could have hundreds of them filled with oil, making deliveries worldwide for no fuel costs." Said the man with the withered hand thoughtfully. They made a slightly more sophisticated model to replace the one that had disappeared out to sea, so they could show the boss. He was the sort who liked to have something tangible. "It's clever," the boss said when Eduardo explained how he thought it could be used. "But the oil companies have millions invested in ships, and they are a bit big even for us." "Yes," said the man with the withered hand, "I realised that. There were a couple of other drawbacks too. The amount of ocean it would take up would mean a big risk of something running into it, and it would be hard to steer." The boss nodded. He liked people who understood him instantly. "But several things struck me," continued the man with the withered hand. "A single unit might only look like a bit of floating rubbish or a drifting buoy. And if it had a radio receiver in it, it could be made to steer for a radio signal. Of course, the cargo would have to be something dearer than oil to justify the expense." They smiled knowingly at each other. "I knew you wouldn't bring this to me without reason. If we made the string longer, it would run aground well offshore, close enough in for a small boat to snag the string and collect it without looking suspicious. Far enough out, it wouldn't be seen." "But if you used it like that, no one would know your honour had been satisfied," objected Eduardo. "I know that. What counts," said the boss with finality. I would know." "That is what counts," said the boss with finality, and they all fell silent, nodding, understanding. Walking back up the beach, the boss was looking thoughtful. "What are you thinking, boss?" asked the man with the withered hand. "I was thinking many things. I was thinking Eduardo has little more than a crush on a certain black-haired girl named Maria." Eduardo blushed crimson to his roots. Was this men's talk? But the boss had not finished. "I was thinking that arrogant blonde pig of a boss is a pain." "Germans," spat the man with the withered hand. "You limit yourself, my friend," said the boss. "Not all of them are bad. Young Eduardo has a friend who has invited him to come and stay." Eduardo looked surprised. He naively thought his private affairs private. "Did he tell you about his mother?" "Not exactly Baader Meinhof, but of that ilk in her youth, I believe." He glanced at Eduardo. The boy's face was frozen. "Well, did he tell you?" Eduardo struggled for a moment before he said, "I'm sorry, it is a matter of honour, sir." The boss smiled, turned to the man with the withered hand in the conversation. "You hear? He calls me sir instead of boss. I think that confirms it. I remember the surname. We supplied the documents when she wanted out. Still, he's right. Keeping a confidence breeds confidence. That is what brings information, and information is all. We are what we know. For example, that arrogant blonde pig feels unsafe wherever he goes, so he carries a tiny handgun in the little pocket in the left side of that ridiculous suit he always wears. His first premise is false. He's my guest. He's safer than he's ever been. His second assumption is also false. If he started to lift that pocket flap, he would hit the floor dead before his hand was inside. he's no safer for having it. Information can work both ways. The fool will misapply it and believe what is false. But good intelligence gives the intelligent the advantage. The boss was feeling expansive and waxing philosophical. Then his tone resumed the briskness of the practical man of action. Eduardo, I think your idea has promise. He gestured expansively towards the horizon where the device had disappeared. But so far, that is all. We will have to put considerable work into this before it starts to pay. In the meantime, I would like you to take up the offer of your friend. We need an ear on the ground in that area if we are to replace the blonde one. It will take you away from the girl as well. Her father will be less easy now the season is ended and you both have time on your hands. Consider this. He's a made man who owns his land. You are the layabout son of a widowed mother who rents a tiny shack. You have native intelligence. If you learn to use it like a man, you may find your fortune in the north. They had reached the top of the beach, and now he turned, clapped Eduardo on the back, clasped both the hands of the man with the withered hand in both of his, and then set off up the street, whistling a snatch of Brandenburg. "German!" he called over his shoulder as he turned the corner to disappear up one of the tiny, steep, cobbled streets. The man with the withered hand and Eduardo looked at each other. "He likes you," said the man with the withered hand. That night, Eduardo dreamed of diamonds embedded in ice walls. He and Heinrich slaughtered the pig in the great cavern they formed and feasted on it in company with the girl with black hair, while the blonde boss danced for them, a jerking, Lowry matchstick man in a Vetriano setting. When he awoke, he was unsure if the dream had been light or very dark. Most boys from the village stayed close to their mothers until they found her replacement and married. In their family, it had always been different. Many people locally regarded Eduardo's mother as a hard woman because she brought up her son to be independent. But now it paid. Much had to be done before he went. Buying a ticket for the bus at the little quayside shack, borrowing a cardboard suitcase and filling it with warm clothes for a winter he'd never known before. Through the internet, he'd arranged a job. "Remember," said the boss, "the least conspicuous person is the one doing normal things. Besides, I can't afford to keep you for months on chance." He opened an account at the local bank so he could send his mother back part of his wage. The boss would have helped, but she was not one for charity. Then he arranged with a friend she could not refuse to come and help her with the heavier tasks. Being independent didn't mean there was any lack of affection or care where it counted. Even so, arriving in the mainland town and waiting with a group of returning labourers for the bus, Eduardo had felt alone for the first time in his life. Even at sea in a boat or walking the mountains, he had known his community was there. His conversations with the other passengers on the bus had been guarded and careful, as they had never been in his life before. His bum ached from the long hours in the hard seat, and before they arrived he'd read every word of every advert in the tattered magazines that were passed around the bus. At the border, The guard had sneered at his identity card. "Father unknown," he'd read aloud to everyone. "More ignorant scum." Eduardo flushed and was very aware of the bone-handled knife in his pocket. But he restrained himself. And as an EU resident, the guard had to admit him. Finally, he'd arrived, and there was Heinrich waiting at the modern bus station, open-armed and unrestrained to welcome him. They returned to the tiny flat where Heinrich showed him the room they would share, and Eduardo showered and changed. Two pages by mistake. Over the meal of strange northern foods, Heinrich's mother questioned him about the people back home as though she knew them all. "Heinrich had told me so much. Your mother was good to him. You will always be welcome here." It didn't take him long to fall into the routine of genuine Italian barista at the coffee house, and with Heinrich's help he soon started making the contacts the boss needed. Routine breeds complacency. When he heard the front door latch, Eduardo assumed that Heinrich or his mother had popped out unheard. It was only as he came through the hall the cold tones of a familiar voice in the front room alerted him that all was not well. "You have been interfering with my affairs, contacting my people." Heinrich's mother started to protest. "Quiet, my dear. You and I will have our fun after I have dealt with him." "Why, you scum!" Heinrich reached for the poker in the grate beside him, as the cold blonde boss reached for the small left-hand pocket in his ridiculous suit. Eduardo caught him under the arms as he collapsed. Only the bone handle of the knife showed, just below the breastbone. The point was buried in his cold heart. Heinrich took the feet, and they carried him through to the shower, where they stripped him and hung him up. Eduardo extracted the bone-handled knife and slit his throat to let the blood run down the drain in an orderly fashion before jointing the body for disposal. Turning, he saw Heinrich standing with tears running down his face. "Don't be daft," he said. "He would have killed you both and done unspeakable things to your mother first." "I know," said Heinrich. "It wasn't that. Just for a moment, it reminded me of the poor pig." For a minute, they collapsed in each other's arms in helpless laughter before continuing their grisly task. The body parts were wrapped securely and dropped in the coffee house's garbage dumpster, halfway up in the middle of the rubbish. The efficient municipal authority burned all such rubbish to provide heat for its offices. Be the first time that bastard isn't cold. His clothes and the clothes they'd been wearing went the same way, along with the bone handle from the knife. I'll make a new one next time we have lamb. The blade and tang were polished till they shone. The shower, bathroom walls and floor were washed down several times with neat bleach. They took the keys from his pocket, found his car parked nearby, and drove it out to the country by back roads, avoiding cameras. There they smothered it in petrol and set light to it. Of course, the precautions were mostly unnecessary. No one would report him missing or mourn him, but it pays to be careful. Much later, they sat in Eduardo's mother's house back in the south, and told all this to the boss. "Take people as you find them," he said. "Where there is mercy, show mercy. Where there is none, show none." Then he embraced them both, kissing them on both cheeks. "So," said his mother, "the sons take after the father." The boss looked at her sharply, and Heinrich and Eduardo looked from him to her, back to him, and then at each other. Realization slowly dawning. Eduardo's invention had been developed and improved during their absence, and all next summer he pushed pedalos in and out and patrolled in the new safety boat the boss had bought, ensuring they did not stray beyond the bay into the larger sea waves where foreign coasters passed offshore. In the evenings he'd take the boat out to his lobster pots beyond the bay, returning with his catch to the hotel. Here he would hear news of Heinrich from mutual friends who came for holidays. Heinrich was busy in the north all that summer. That autumn, Eduardo was finally able to afford a piece of land and approached Maria's father for her hand. Heinrich and his mother came south for the wedding, and Heinrich's mother stayed, moving in with Eduardo's mother when he moved out. Those northern winters had become too much for an old body. Heinrich became quite the businessman, travelling between north and south. But he never wore ridiculous suits. Thank you very much. I finally got through the long one. Do have a look back through my back catalogue. There are all sorts of stories in there. Thank you.